Hello audience, Mr. Z here with yet another very exciting alternate history scenario for you. What if the 1956 Hungarian Revolution was successful? First, a bit of background information. In the years following the fall of the Third German Reich, Hungary saw occupation and assimilation to the Soviet Union, turning it into a satellite state with a Soviet-appointed leader. This would be the case with East Germany, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Romania, who would go on to form the Eastern Bloc, who would serve as a defensive barrier for the Soviet Union upon the adoption of the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, or as we know it, the Warsaw Pact. As you could imagine, there was a great deal of internal conflict within the Eastern Bloc. These states had their political systems flipped from one side of the spectrum to another, leading the social balance in disarray, and giving way to numerous insurgencies, particularly in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Baltic states assimilating to the Soviet Union. But perhaps most notably, Hungary. And that's because almost immediately after Stalin's death, moves were made within Hungary to de-Stalinize the nation and exert further autonomy from the Soviet Union, seemingly signaling that Stalin's cult of personality was over and would lead to the steady end of the USSR. Stalin's death also meant the replacement of Hungarian leader and staunch Stalinist Rákosi by reformist Imre Nagy, who put Hungary on a more liberal path. To the Hungarian people, this signaled the beginning of a freer Hungary and an opportunity to speak openly of communism in the Soviet Union. But boy, were they mistaken. Months later, students and workers would begin protesting en masse in Budapest, carrying Hungarian flags with the Soviet emblem cut out to signal a desire for more autonomy. This would erupt into a period of armed conflicts between pro-Soviet military, the rebels, who, making swift work of the present military force, would go on to release Hungarian prisoners and tear down a statue of Stalin, which they'd protested as a symbol of tyranny and oppression. Nagy announced that Hungary would be withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact and would abolish the oppressive doctrines imposed by the Soviets. Khrushchev did not take too kindly to the thought of Hungary leaving the Warsaw Pact, and thus sent in military to retake Budapest and execute Nagy. The Hungarian rebels simply stood no chance against the full onslaught of Soviet forces, and it's unlikely any Western powers would get involved simply out of fear of starting a much larger conflict. So exactly how would we go about giving the Hungarians a victory in the Revolution of 1956? The way I see it, there are two probable options with similar outcomes. The Hungarian Revolution and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact would either need to inspire further revolutions within the Eastern Bloc in order to overwhelm the Soviet forces, or Soviet forces would need to simply stand down and allow Hungary to go free. This, however, would demonstrate to other members of the Eastern Bloc how easy it would be to break away, leading to numerous revolts within Czechoslovakia, Estonia, East Germany, and Poland, which no doubt would leave the USSR scrambling to reclaim its former satellites. Either way, it would seem conflict is going to erupt between the Soviet Union and parts of the Eastern Bloc, as well as other nations within the Soviet sphere of influence who may desire autonomy. Czechoslovakia and Poland would stand the greatest chance of combating the USSR for a prolonged period of time, with the additional strategic positioning of nations like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These nations wouldn't pose a significant threat to the USSR, however, would pull enough resources to seriously undermine the Soviet efforts to outcompete the US in the Cold War. Add to the fact that this would cut the USSR off from East Germany, and you're left with much of the Eastern Bloc irreparably breaking away from the Soviets. Albania would soon leave the Warsaw Pact while the Soviet forces are mobilized to resecure Romania and Bulgaria, straining the Soviet military enough for Hungary to comfortably withdraw from the conflict, securing its independence. Meanwhile, East Germany takes the opportunity to reunite with West Germany, worrying NATO members who feel this may trigger a reaction from the Soviet Union, who would be too preoccupied with maintaining what remains of its Iron Curtain tacked on East Germany. To many within its circle of influence, the USSR would begin to appear like a cardboard bear, imposing in size but flimsy when it comes to keeping its nations in check, firing disillusionment within the Soviet people who would become less motivated to continue the conflict. Khrushchev would become increasingly perceived as a failed leader who could not guide the nation in the same way Stalin did, leading to growing opposition toward his regime and the splintering away of the Soviet territories in the south, all whilst diplomatic exchanges in the current state of conflict emboldened Finland to join the opposition to the Soviet Union. The conflict would grow to the point where the Soviet government would need to realize it had to cut these nations loose, forfeit its competition with the US, or face total collapse. The conflict between the Eastern Bloc and the USSR would have demonstrated how much opposition there was to the Soviet regime, lowering morale and inspiring rebellion, while Khrushchev's inability to easily remedy the situation would cause widespread distrust in the government, further emphasizing the concept of Stalin's cult of personality, something which Khrushchev wouldn't have been able to easily dismiss in his timeline, leading the Soviet Union to steadily decline whilst NATO only grows in influence. Western nations would call for the disarmament of the USSR, which the Soviet government may now be more inclined to obey, seeing as though they're losing more influence every single day. and quite soon their enormous nuclear arsenal may end up in unknown hands. This in turn may be met with aid from the West to maintain order in the region. Of course, this is only if the Soviet Union decides to dismantle its nuclear arsenal, which even in this situation is somewhat of a hit or miss. The end result is an early fracturing collapse of the Soviet Union, with the Eastern Bloc members becoming the dominant force within Eastern Europe come the turn of the century. This would surely have influence on other events such as the Suez Crisis and Cuban Missile Crisis, the latter of which may be averted while the former may see more progress by France, Britain, and Israel, who would further stretch out the Soviet military effort in Egypt. China may soon fill the spot of the Soviet Union as the US's main competitor, leading to a potential extending of the Cold War, kinda like in Fallout. And that is where I'm gonna end today's scenario. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.